Hey, Farmers Branch family. It's time for Bible study from the big comfy chair. We got a little bit different format tonight, a little bit different camera angles, and I took Facebook off my phone, and so I'm coming to you from my iPad in the office. We are studying Daniel's amazing prophecy. What an amazing prophecy. It tells us so much about what we seem in the church to know so little about. We have been studying in the 11th chapter of Daniel. And because of my technical problems, I'm a little bit less prepared here. Let me go to the 11. Okay, there we go. Get it in big print so I can read it without my glasses. So we've been in the 11th chapter of Daniel. And you remember that so far in the 10th and 11th chapters, they have concerned themselves with clearly historical events. And it tells the story of the Greeks gaining control over the people of God. These events are associated with the third of four beasts in Daniel 9, if you'll recall that. And you remember there that there's an abomination of desolation spoken of. And we're going to see that there's an abomination of desolation spoken of here, but they're two different things, and they're two different agents of Antichrist. There's been a grave mistake in taking this 10th, 11th, and 12th chapter, and which speaks so precisely against the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires, Greek empires that controlled Judea, that swapped control of Judea. And this despicable individual, Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, God manifest, and it speaks of him. Now, we have to understand that there's a lot of Bible that's dedicated to tell this story, and yet we never associate this story with those portions of Scripture. The story in Ezekiel 38 of Gog and Magog concerned themselves with this time. It really does. And if we have time, I may take an extra class and take you there. The revelation, the events of the sixth trumpet, including the entirety of the second woe, includes this period of history. And that includes the story of the two witnesses. From the beginning of the sixth trumpet to the end of the story of the two witnesses, it concerns itself with the same period of history that we're studying in Daniel now. It doesn't speak to our future. It tells our past in apocalyptic language. So I won't be looking at the camera. I'll be looking mainly at my computer screen. So I hope that doesn't annoy you too badly. But so far in the 10th and 11th chapters, we've been talking about the conflict between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires, the four remaining empires that were carved out of Alexander's empire. And we had gotten down to the 21st verse, and we covered some of it last week, but I want to backtrack a little bit to the 21st verse, because that's where the story of Antiochus Epiphanes, these kings all carry a lot of Ptolemies, which is Ptolemy IV is the current king of the south, and this king of the north is Antiochus, and there have been a lot of Antiochuses, and there are a lot of Seleucuses, and the names tend to recur. And so, but in the 21st verse here is where Daniel begins to prophesy very specifically and precisely about the events that surround this particular Seleucid Greek ruler and his interaction with the Ptolemaic king, Ptolemy IV, and the king of the south. So this is still about the king of the north and the king of the south, but this king of the north is a particularly interesting individual. And Daniel, speaking hundreds of years before he actually existed, describes him precisely. And the story we will read is the story that's told in the books of the Maccabees, largely, especially First and Second Maccabees. This part of the story is told, and it corroborates Daniel's prophecy almost to the letter. It's just an amazing prophecy. So let's go back up to the 21st verse. He, this king of the north, will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. You remember Antiochus was being held as a hostage in Rome, and because he was kind of the son nobody wanted to talk about, and he was not particularly impressive, but he obviously cunning. He said he will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. And if you know the history of this story of how Antiochus and his ascension to power, I'll get the right word out in a minute, you'll know that just describes it precisely. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. And you remember that Onias III, the last righteous high priest of Israel, is this priest of the covenant that ends up being murdered, actually in a plot by his own brothers, so that they can succeed to the throne, to the high priesthood. After coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people, he will rise to power. And you remember the story of Jason, the brother of Onias III, who bribes his way into the high priesthood, and then Menelaus, who ups the ante and takes it from I just said the name. Anyway, and they jockey back and forth for control of the high priesthood. So he just takes a few people and he raises them to power and acts with deception. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers, and he will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. With a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The two kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. Now, this is describing the events. We went through the events in a lot of detail last week. At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. And here, these are the events surrounding the Maccabean Civil War, if you remember our study of Maccabees. And if you don't, you really, really, really need to read, especially the first 3 books of Maccabees, that will tell you the story of this period of history in just amazing detail. Then you'll understand why that period is so important. Why it's so important that Ezekiel 38 devotes time to it. Why Daniel's prophecy is largely about that period of time. Why the book of Revelation spends so much time describing it in apocalyptic literature. This was the most dangerous time in the entire history of Judah. This was the time when the messianic light was nearly extinguished, lay figuratively dead in the streets of Jerusalem. This is where the law and the prophets prophesied, but in sackcloth, the garments of mourning. This is the time that Judah almost forfeited its messianic promise. It's just that the days like this have not been seen again Judah. Now they've been destroyed and they've been scattered and they've suffered some terrible, terrible things. But from a spiritual standpoint, this was the absolutely most dangerous time because this was leading up into the immediate revelation of their Messiah. And just a spiritual drama unfolding that exceeds even this considerable geopolitical drama. And you remember, we just read about the ships of the western coastlands. I told you the story last week about how the Roman senator drew a circle around Antiochus and said, you'll make a decision before you leave this circle, not giving him any option. So here he comes back, and he will turn and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. And these are the events described in the book of the Maccabees, where the urban Jews, especially around Jerusalem, forsook their worship. They forsook the laws of Moses and their customs. They had crude surgeries to try to reverse the cosmetic effects of their circumcisions, trying to undo the covenant that God made with Abraham. Their attentions turned away from the temple and to the gymnasium, the place of nakedness, the epitome of Greek culture. And they loved all things Greek. They spoke Greek. They dressed like Greeks. They acted like Greeks. They forsook the law and the prophets and began to even neglect the daily sacrifice. And we've already covered that a little bit back with the 2300 evenings and mornings. We're going to actually see it again at the end of the 12th chapter, at the end of the book of Daniel. It'll make reference to that time, that specific time again. Okay, and here's where we get to that next abomination of desolation. Now this one is in Jesus' past by about 200 years during his ministry. But we know that in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus refers to a abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, yet in the future. Now, for that, we have to go back to the 7th chapter. We have to understand that that is another Antichrist. That is really the Antichrist that the Apostle Paul talks about when he talks about the man of lawlessness and when the rebellion occurs. That is the next personal Antichrist that John predicts will arise. And John says he will arise from us. Who is the us he's talking about? Will he arise from the church? He certainly arose from the Jewish people. And if there is a personal Antichrist, and for reasons that are a little subtle in the Revelation, especially in the 17th chapter, I believe that there will be an individual leader, an 8th king, who will go to his destruction. And I believe that he will be after the pattern of Bar Kokhba and the rebellion. And this time it's a rebellion against God. It's a war against the Lamb. It is the maturation of that secular Zionism, that Zionism that wants the land of God but rejects the God of the land. And so I believe that that's the model after which we see. I don't believe that the next personal Antichrist that is related to our end time, the one that is, I don't believe he is either the one that Daniel is speaking of here, or the one that Daniel is speaking of in the 7th chapter, or that Jesus is speaking of, or that Paul is speaking of. I believe all those Antichrists have come and gone. But I do believe there is another one after the pattern of the one that Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, leave. And when the Christians saw Bar Kokhba and that he was anointed Messiah by Rabbi Akiva standing in the holy place, they took that to be the fulfillment of Jesus' words. And I do believe that that is, in fact, the case. So these are extraordinarily significant times in the history of these people. And this is coming, they call this the end time here in this prophecy, because this is coming upon the end of the 70 weeks, the 77s that are allotted to Daniel's people. You remember the 9th chapter, he says, I've allotted 77s for your people, Daniel. And so what we see in that 77s is this very dangerous time of spiritual apostasy that recovers. The two witnesses are resurrected, but then they get progressively corrupt leading up to the coming of Jesus, the incarnation. And so those two witnesses are taken up to heaven. And you remember in the Revelation it speaks of a great earthquake, and that was the literal earthquake of 31 BC in Jerusalem, in which 7,000 people were killed in Jerusalem. Josephus says 30,000 were killed throughout the Levant. Violent earthquake, one of the most powerful earthquakes in the last 2,000 years. But anyway, that's a little bit scattered. I just want you to understand that this is talking about Antiochus. And a lot of prophecy teachers like to apply this description to an Antichrist that remains in our future. But if you'll read Maccabees, you're gonna recognize the events that we're reading about here in just a second. 31. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who knew their God will firmly resist him. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. And when they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at an appointed time. You can't read this and read the first two books of the Maccabees without recognizing the story. Now, if you want to stick your nose in some lame prophecy book instead of your Bible, you go ahead. But I'm going to teach you better. And in 38, the Facebook keeps turning me off here, so just bear with me. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. Antiochus Epiphanes. This is going to be a wild night. Antiochus Epiphanes, who called himself God manifest. That's who this is talking about. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Now, let's tell this story. Antiochus placed an altar that overlay the altar of God in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this god he venerated was Zeus Olympus. Now, Olympus, we talk about Mount Olympus because there is a literal Mount Olympus, but Olympus, in terms of the pantheon of Greece, was a fortress, and the chief ruler of that fortress was Zeus. And so he worshipped Zeus Olympus. His forefathers, the Seleucids, were very fond of Apollo worship. They didn't worship Zeus. They worshiped primarily Apollo. And there was this cult of Adonis that accompanied the worship of Apollo. And Adonis was the one desired by women. It turns out that Adonis was actually bisexual because he was the lover of Apollo as well as the lover of Aphrodite and Persephone in the underworld. So, and Persephone and Aphrodite would fight over him. He was the one desired by women. And the cult, there was a lot of really strange stuff about the cult of Adonis. It involved much the same worship as the Baals in Canaan. In fact, Adonis cult really came out of Canaan and the Near East. This was not at first a Roman part of the Roman mythology. And so here Antiochus fulfills this prophecy to a T. So he will show no regard for the God of his ancestors or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any God, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God unknown to his ancestors he will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land or for a bribe. At the time of the end, and the time of this end of this story, the end of this king, Antiochus, the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. This is the king of the south again. Ptolemies are coming back up to challenge Antiochus's rule. He will also invade the beautiful land, Judea. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasure. I don't know why Facebook keeps trying to turn me off here. We won't have this set up next week. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt with the Libyans, Cushites in submission. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, and yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Now if we go to, now we begin with the 12th chapter. And I don't have my usual clock in front of me. I will ask Sonia, would you please hand me my phone? Bear with me here. If I've already gone for 3 hours, I'll try not to do it again. So then we pick up with the story in the 12th chapter. And so let's continue, because this confuses a lot of people too. And at that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, everyone whose name is found written in the book will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Talking about the eventual resurrection of the dead. And some of them will have performed wickedly. Okay. I just need to, would you signal me when 8 o'clock hits? Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't have a clock. So this is not talking about contemporaneous resurrection. It's talking about the resurrection at the end of things. This is an end time, it is not the end time. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, roll up and seal up the words of this scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood 2 others, one on this bank of the river and one on the opposite bank. One of them said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled? The man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, lifted his right hand and his left hand towards heaven, and I heard him swear by him who lives forever, saying, it will be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed. And what things? What things are they talking about here that take 3.5 years? It's the time that Michael arises, the great prince that protects the people of Israel. And that time of distress, and that time where the wise shine like the brightness of the heavens, and the people of God are strong and do exploits, in the King James Version. That's these things that it's speaking of. I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, my Lord, what will the outcome of all this be? Well, we know the outcome of all this is the revelation of God's Messiah, his rejection, and the final destruction of the people of Daniel, whose time has come. Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, made spotless, and refined. We're talking about the end of the 77s, not our coming in time. Many will be purified, made spotless, and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. Now, what's this talking about? Scholars have puzzled over this forever. I cannot find a single commentary that will support what I'm about to tell you. But what I'm about to tell you is something that really can be derived from a simple reading of the books of Maccabees and knowing the story that's being told here and rightfully identifying what piece of history Daniel is prophesying towards. It's history for us. It was the future for Daniel. When the priests became enthralled by everything Greek and Greek culture, and the temple was very convenient to the gymnasium where the athletic events, the wrestling matches, and all were held. And 1,290 days certainly does match the period of time that they forsook the sacrifices. They forsook the sacrifices in the temple well before Antiochus ever desecrated the temple. It was abandoned by its priests. Now that's one reason I think that Jews today tell a much different story about the events surrounding Hanukkah or the Feast of Dedication. For them, it's about a miracle of magic oil that burned much longer than it should have. That's nowhere in the book of Maccabees. But what instead is told is what may be a very embarrassing story, that it wasn't the mean, evil Greeks that provided the apostasy. It was their own apostasy. Miraculously rescued by God. And so for 1,290 days, the priests abandoned the sacrifice. Then Antiochus set up the abomination of desolation. And then after 1,335 days, the temple was rededicated. Amazing story, amazing prophecy. So blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of that terrible time in the history of the people of God. So in 13, we have the final statement in Daniel's prophecy. As for you, go your way till the end. Till your end, not the end of this prophecy. You'll be dead long before this prophecy is fulfilled. You will rest, and then at the end of the days you will rise. I think this is a signal that we need to go. All my computers are falling off the desk now in an avalanche. I've enjoyed teaching this portion of prophetic scripture. The prophecy of Daniel is just amazing, and it's so specific in its fulfillment. To understand it, you need to read your Bible. To understand it, you need to read the books of the Maccabees. You need to understand that Ezekiel 38, Gog and Magog speaks to this time. And I think I'll take a mind to do that next week. I'll do Ezekiel 38 next week. And then the significant portion of the book of Revelation, the events of the seventh trumpet, all the way up through the story of the two witnesses, concerns itself in the history. I hope that technically it gets easier next week. But Farmers Branch, until then, take care.